So thanks very much, everybody, for joining. I'm Associate Professor Ben Neville. I'm one of the Deputy Directors here at Melbourne Climate Futures. I do want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet, wherever you are. I'm at Melbourne Connect, so I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Very pleased to have Dr. Adam Bumpus here today to speak to us about the promise and pitfalls of climate tech. I'll give a bit of an introduction to Adam and his incredibly varied career. Adam's worked in climate technology for around 20 years and is currently an honorary fellow with us here at Melbourne Climate Futures. He's also currently Principal Sustainability Consultant at Senversa. He began this varied career as an academic following a PhD at Oxford and then here at the University of Melbourne in the faculties of Science and Business and Economics, doing research on global carbon markets, international accelerators in the clean energy ecosystem, and running entrepreneurship boot camps. Adam's been an entrepreneur himself, founding a startup using blockchain and Internet of Things technology. He's a co-founder of the Internet of Energy network using Web 3.0 digital infrastructure, and before that co-founded a media and communications agency delivering international climate and energy strategic communication projects for the UN and World Bank in the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. You may have also seen Adam around Melbourne emceeing events or as the climate spokesperson on the project on TV. So Adam's clearly extremely accomplished and experienced to talk to us on the promise and pitfalls of climate tech. He'll speak for about 20 to 25 minutes and then we'll have time for some Q&A. So please enter any questions that you have for Adam in the Q&A function. So with that, Adam, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. It's super to be here, and I thank you for the introduction there. I'd like to acknowledge also the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, wherever we are. And for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And today is an important thing because we're going to talk about climate tech, but actually, the thing that Ben sort of covered in my introduction, there's a lot of different stuff on academia and business and things, but actually, the thing that I want to talk about is why we need to think about climate tech as a human issue and why that's really important for going forward in the future. And you know, my work right now, both at Melbourne Uni as an honorary fellow, but also in the fantastic boutique consultancy of Senversa, we're working on very technical things, but we're actually dealing with people. And we're dealing with people who are nervous about what's happening in the future and dealing with people who are worried about risk around climate change and what they can do about it. And they're worried about the technology. Can the technology do what it says it's going to do? Is it actually going to get us out of this problem? And that's what I want to talk about today. And so I figured I'd start with actually, even though we've done lots of these different things and varied is a very great adjective, thanks, Ben. Actually, just been a person spending 20 odd years trying to think about the way our environment works, the way commodities work, the way environmental market mechanisms work that drive change around the world and drive change towards more equitable access to resources, to equitable development around the world in different countries, to sustaining our climate in a safest possible way. And so this is a picture of me in 2008 sitting at UC Santa Cruz when I was a visiting scholar there, working with an incredible professor, Margaret Fitzsimmons, on the commodification of nature and who wins and what do we get out of it and why are we doing this? And this really is the thing that drives me here, and it's technology that's actually sat at the linchpin between humans and the environment and what we're doing to the environment, to climate change, and what we're doing to try and resolve the climate change issue as well. So that's what I want to talk about today. And the conclusion here is that if we're going to think about climate change and climate tech, and if climate tech will save the world, actually, it's really about humans. So let's get into that and think about what that looks like. All right, so what does this picture mean and why we have this in the climate tech talk? So I guess the question here is, what is the mascot of a big conference, an exercise bike, the CEO and co-founder of Holochain have to do with climate tech? And why does this picture give me lots of hope? We'll answer that as we go through today. So here's climate tech, the pitfalls and possibilities in a few pictures. The first one is this. So the good news story. We probably will peak our emissions this year in the fossil fuel industry and the power industry. So burning of fossil fuels has been the major driver of climate change to date. There are lots of other things: deforestation, agriculture, different ways we generate, like the way we use energy and fugitive emissions, that kind of thing. But actually, the principal driver was the burning of fossil fuels for our power systems. And so the latest forecast from the International Energy Agency look like we are starting to go into a structural decline in emissions. And this is happening because of deployment of renewable energy around the world. And so you can see here on this piece of work from Climate Analytics that solar, wind, electric vehicles, and other technologies deploying clean energy, which is displacing dirty energy. This is a good news story. And this is hardware. This is the hardware of climate tech. And the hardware of climate tech looks a bit like this. So to get us to the outcome for clean energy by 2050, it's scaling up renewables like this. So number of households with solar on it, solar thermal and geothermal, the ability to pull these things together, renewables in generation, the capacity of additions going on. So these are all just great graphs that come up to show us exactly what we need to be doing to drive ourselves towards net zero by 2050. So we kind of know most of the technologies that can get us to 2050. We don't really know many of the technologies that will take us past 2050 when we have to draw down emissions. But today I'm going to mostly focus and talk about energy. I want to talk about energy because it has been the source of around 3/4 of greenhouse gases that we've got in the atmosphere. And it's absolutely key that we solve the energy issues to drive us towards, to avoid the worst effects of climate change and drive us towards a stable future. So energy is pretty critical in this. And if you look at some of the examples around the world from different consultancy companies, this is from McKinsey, they're actually saying, well, we've got a suite of hardware technologies that can get us out of this problem. So this is 12 technologies that McKinsey's put forward as, well, this is a way for us to, if we put these out there, we can deal with climate change. And that's pretty good. The challenge is we don't have many of these technologies post 2050. And the challenge with this is these are all highly technical solutions to climate change, which are only owned by a few organizations, companies, and proportions of the world. This is not a blueprint for a complete global equity approach to climate change dealing with this in emissions, but it is the hardware that we need. So let's think about climate tech as, first of all, any technology that gets out there that can reduce emissions or reduce the impact of climate change on society. And it starts with wave one, which is hardware. And this is being deployed. It's happening out there. It's solar, it's wind, it's geothermal. All that stuff is happening. It's in the environment. It's making it work. The next wave is software. So software in climate tech is actually one of the very greatest and most important developments that we're seeing in climate tech. And this is a map from Sapphire Ventures that was pulled out from 2024. A really wide variety of software companies, startups, and existing companies like IBM and Salesforce, etc., putting forward software platforms to deal with climate issues. And this goes from carbon accounting, environmental, social, and governance accounting, understanding carbon offsets, dealing with climate risk and adaptation, food and agriculture, tons in energy and mobility. And these are really solutions in climate tech that connect data points and connect different systems that we already have. And so if you think about this in the evolution of the internet, Web 1 was you go on a website and you might be able to buy something or do something. Web 2 was the ability for people to generate their own content like YouTube, stick their own things up online and get that consumed by others. This is kind of like the second stage. This is wave 2 of climate tech. And I put out a paper with a colleague from Stanford in 2017 in Nature Climate Change, which was on this wave 1 versus wave 2. And we can see structurally in the economy, this shifting towards this wave from hardware to software. And when you think about this, climate tech is then really embedded within the rest of our society. We're so used to using software for absolutely everything we do that's associated with kind of our work and associated with computers, of course. And what this is doing is bringing the technology prowess of software into climate change and trying to help solve that as an issue. And so I'd like to give a couple examples that are nearer by here, which are ones like this. So down our friends at Volta Rocks doing some really interesting stuff on how do you understand your energy bill, providing you with data and analytics on how to save your energy bill and bringing in artificial intelligence to support that. And then a fantastic company that's at Melbourne Accelerator program called ClimateSense, which takes large amounts of data points and condenses that and aggregates that to give you a climate risk assessment associated with certain parts and different geographic locations. And so what this is doing is the software is giving us information so that we can make good decisions about climate change, good decisions about where we use energy, good decisions about where we plan and take our businesses going forward. And organizations like Carbon Plan, based out of the United States, are also playing a really important role in using data sets and software to sense check and to create some validity and verification that some of the work that's happening on climate change, such as in carbon offsets, is actually true and verifiable and can be reported in a certain way. And so what this means is some of this software is really working hard to provide better data points and connections, but it's also working hard to provide some transparency and cross-referencing across different data sets that exist out there. So wave one, hardware, great. Wave two, software that gives us more connectivity and gives us an understanding of how we can use the existing hardware in a better way. What's next? Well, to follow the web analogy, web one to web two, web one, go to a website, web two, generate user content, and that gets proliferated around the internet. Web three is the ability to own a piece of the internet and to own the way that systems engage and interact online. And web three is akin to blockchain. And then, of course, we've got artificial intelligence. And when we're thinking about climate tech as software and hardware, I believe we're moving into now the wave three of climate tech. And wave three is the integration of artificial intelligence across our systems in many, many different ways that we understand the world, but especially in climate tech. And an important discussion around this is, what does artificial intelligence mean for the net benefit and the net disbenefit of using it for climate tech? And how might artificial intelligence and Web3 be used together? So what is AI in climate tech? So AI in climate tech can do some really interesting, good things. It can improve the models we have for climate change impacts. It can improve the speed at which we look at global circulation models and dynamics around ice flows. It can give us better, faster improvements on those models. It can more accurately forecast energy supply and demand in complex microgrids and complex grid systems in electricity in general. So artificial intelligence is very good at taking large data sets and crunching that into something which is useful and actionable. It can do things like improve transport routes for electric vehicles, agricultural efficiency and waste reduction, and improve our prediction around resilience and disaster management when climate impacts are hitting. And so AI is a really interesting approach here when we're thinking about mitigation in terms of reducing our emissions. Some examples out there from certain different consultancies look at reducing greenhouse gas emissions for a professional services firm by 5 to 10%. And that's an interesting and kind of reasonable number to look at for adaptation resilience. It can be used to help boost the way that we adapt to climate change by understanding the projections of those hazards coming forward. And the fundamental part of it is that when I was back at Oxford, some of my friends in the Environmental Change Institute were climate physicists, and they were running climateprediction.net, which was running using the latent computing power and people's screensavers to run to help augment the massive global circulation models. And so they were using decentralized compute power to drive this, which was a really cool way of thinking about software to help drive our climate analytics. But what's cool about this in AI now is that we can drive that faster because the large language models, when connected to a RAG database and connected to a graph database, which we can come into another time to make things much more specific, can drive better understanding of what those models look like. The challenge, and we'll come to this in a second here, is that if you look at most of the words on the screen here, they're improvements, they're more accurately, they are augmenting and making it better, rather than doing something fundamentally new. And that's because AI relies on the data sets we already have. So there is a challenge there around creating fundamental breakthroughs through AI. It might be coming, and we might be at that exponential curve where, the lily pond metaphor, where lilies grow exponentially. And so on the last day before the lily pond is complete, the pond is covered completely in lilies, it's only half covered because it's growing exponentially. On that last day, it doubles again in size. We might be on the cusp of that for some of these breakthroughs, but we just don't know as yet. So what can AI do right now? What is it doing right now for climate tech? Well, this is a pretty big deal. It's a really interesting piece of work here. This is from MethaneSat, and this is a collaborative piece of work that's released by Google, Environmental Defense Fund, Bezos Earth Foundation, BAE Systems in Defense, putting up satellites in space to look at specifically where methane is being emitted. Now, methane is a massive greenhouse gas, a very important greenhouse gas that has kind of slipped through the net on regulation to a certain extent, and also very hard to see where it's coming. And a lot of methane comes from agriculture, but it also comes from fugitive emissions from oil and gas plants. And so one of the key things here is this thing, satellite in space, is using AI to really differentiate where methane is being emitted. And this is a useful thing for us to have, because we can start to get a hold of where these emissions are coming from and start to deal with it. But how do we know what data is real? And how do we know the challenges that come from AI are when we get something back from AI that's going to be correct? And I think this is where we start to see the use of Web3 and blockchain really coming to the fore. Now, blockchain was a big hype in 2016, 17, 18. I'm really happy that it's kind of dropped away from the hype, and it's actually just the work that's happening here. Because if you look at blockchain, there's some really useful things that it can bring to this climate tech debate. The first thing is that it can create transparency in climate relevant actions. And so if you can create transparency in something that has happened, so for example, a solar cell on a roof is putting energy into the grid, and we know what's happening, it's what time it is, how much energy is being into the grid, and what does that look like? Or you know that from an IoT device, from an Internet of Things device, there is something monitoring a tree in a specific certain place that says, yes, this is that data, and that data hasn't been tampered with. There's some nuances here we can talk about. Then you've got some real transparency on what is happening in the real world. And that's really important, because then when you feed that data into an AI model, it's dealing with real data that is true rather than some data that might not be true. So the blockchain is really good at doing that. And on the right here, behind my head, and you'll see these slides later, is some work from the Rocky Mountain Institute in 2022 that talks about the kind of core problems that exist in climate change and data, and how blockchain and distributed ledgers can really support that. The second part is that if you can trust those actions, you can have verified data. You can then get to this third part, which is auditable provenance. Now, I'll come to the drivers in this in a minute, but what's really important about this is if we cannot know where our data comes from and what it actually is producing and why it's there and why it's created in the first place, we cannot trust any actions that are put on top of it. What the blockchain can do in a really interesting way is find that data and make it immutable. And we'll come back to our buffer quantum friends on the bicycles in a minute, because if you can make the data immutable, i.e. it can't be changed, then you can audit it more effectively. And the drivers that are coming are pushing for this more and more. The final bit here is equity and access to finance. One of the largest and most challenging problems around dealing with climate change is the role of sustainable finance, which our friend Arj, of course, is going to talk about in a few weeks. But the challenge that sits with this around the world is also who has access to finance in different ways. And if anything, blockchain and crypto is very good at doing finance in different ways, because that's basically what it was built for in the first place. And so the transfer of currencies associated with value. If we can apply that to a climate lens, we can also start to look at how we can drive new finance in new different areas. And so a couple of examples here from RMI, another example from a former student at Ben and mine, Martin Weinstein, who's doing incredible stuff in the US on Open Earth Foundation and nested climate metrics and using the blockchain to deal with cities and their own emissions. So really good examples there of how the blockchain can be used to jump in. Okay, that's really cool. All that stuff is great. So what's the problem and what's driving it? So why do we have all this technology being pushed out there in the first place? It's actually really good news. The drivers are coming in. The drivers to push this forward are starting to exist. And it mainly is coming from regulation. Now, regulation has been far too slow. You know, we had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change signed in 1992. We didn't get the Paris Agreement till 2015. So we are slow on the regulation. And so now we're nearly 10 years past that, but the regulation is coming from industry and from large bodies like the Carbon Disclosure Project, from integrated reporting, basically filtering into the ISSB, lots of acronyms. And for us, that's important here in Australia, the Australian Accounting Standards Board compliance. Now, what this means is companies or anything under the Corporations Act, any companies under the Corporations Act here will have to comply by providing a climate disclosure statement if they hit certain thresholds of revenue and employees or emissions. The long story short here is that this is no longer being kind of nice to have. Climate tech is this thing that you should probably think about. Maybe you want to, look good and talk about it at the barbecue. It's actually now a core business process, and it's going to become mandated for directors to sign off their declarations. That means company directors are getting a little bit worried if they don't have this done properly. And one of the things that is crucial on this is bringing this regulation from environmental regulation into financial regulation. This is financially relevant, it's financially material climate impacts and greenhouse gas emissions that you have to report on. So this means that climate tech is starting to get even more a spotlight to help drive these drive changes. And all of the picture I put up of all the different software companies and the things that they're providing, they are servicing this market for companies who are concerned and need to comply to these rules. The other part that's driving this is just the impact of climate change. And so, yes, the compliance is coming, but actually there is a broad groundswell now of people around the world who understand, obviously, climate change is real. It's caused by humans. We are in an accelerated cycle of climate change because of human action, but we are breaking records left, right, and center. 15 national temperature records broken this year. Work has come out through the National Weather Service and the Union of Concerned Scientists in the US stating that 99% of the population of America, of the United States of America, has been affected by extreme weather and has been given extreme weather warnings in 2024. And what's critical about this is a large proportion of that population has also had multiple warnings at the same time. At the same time, we're seeing 68 million people affected by late rains and drought in southern and sub-Saharan Africa. So this is just this year. The impacts of climate change are driving people to push for more solutions. And when we're pushing for more solutions, we tend to end up looking for technology to try and get us out of the problem. So why is it a problem? Why should we even be thinking about this? Let's think about AI and blockchain to start with. There's lots of problems with where do we situate our renewable energy resources, offshore wind, onshore wind, environmental permissions, all that kind of stuff is an issue. And software, we can see here is like just standard software that you might buy to do your emissions accounting and that kind of stuff. Yes, that's fine. There might be some challenges with auditability in there, but if we're really thinking about some of the movements going forward and the speed at which AI is taking off, we need to think about what the implications are for that as a climate tech solution. Is it worth using? A wave of data-hungry applications means a wave of energy-hungry applications. And that's where we're going to get some challenges. So what does that look like? Well, for AI, there's been a lot of talk around what does that mean for energy consumption? And looking at the IEA, the International Energy Agency, their predictions are that AI and cryptocurrency could double the consumption of energy in electricity in data centers by 2026. And so if we look at that, we're saying, well, where's that new energy going to come from? Or is that energy going to be displaced from other renewable sources? So here are the challenges. The way to produce large language models is to train them really well, and training them takes a lot of energy to put through large computing systems. the chips that NVIDIA sells, basically, the company NVIDIA, whose stock has gone through the roof because of AI, essentially is very power intensive, power hungry. So we've heard a lot about that in blockchain and Bitcoin as well. So Bitcoin uses a proof of work, has very hungry, energy intensive processing. And so what happens is if you start to use more of this, the data centers start to use more of these processing tools, we start to get a lot more challenges with where the energy is going to come from and how the energy is produced. There are some studies that show that say that, a call on AI, so you ask an AI a question on the internet, it's 10 times as much energy used as a Google search. The data is not fully clear on this. In fact, it's very hard to show where a specific AI call happens to a specific data center point, and maybe it's more like 4 to 5 times. But the challenge, whether it's 5 or 10 times at this point, and where we're looking at AI at this kind of very early stage, is, well, it's more energy. And so what does that mean for where the energy comes from? There are some challenges here, which when we're thinking about energy and orders of magnitude more of an AI for than just standard search engines, we say, well, if that's going to happen, the data centers need to have more power. And if they're having more power, are they just taking more energy out of the grid, which means then we have to keep on fossil fuel stations? There are some commentaries that say, yes, that is the case, that because the knife edge of energy demand and supply is so thin, as more demand goes up from this, then there will be more challenges for energy providers to keep the lights on and keep the data centers running. It is in energy always a challenge of supply and demand. It has to match essentially to make the grid work. You want to have obviously a bit more supply than demand so you can make that happen. But demand for energy is going up. And so when demand for energy is going up and we don't have an adequate plan for how to meet that, there's going to be a challenge at what gets turned on and what gets turned off, i.e., do we leave fossil fuels running or do we turn them off? The other challenge with renewable energies is that they're intermittent. We don't currently have the amount of storage in the grid to keep a steady form of electricity running from just renewables. So the solar sun shines in the day, the wind blows at certain points in time. That is not useful for data centers, which are running 24/7. All right. Is it all bad? Well, not necessarily. The renewable energy is spreading at pace. So we are getting more renewable energy put out into the world. It is overtaking, has overtaken fossil fuels. And so some of this growth in electricity demand will be given by renewable energy. The challenge is it might not be in the same places that we have the data centers that are running on this. Now, some companies who are putting forward artificial intelligence and using that in their processes, and you'll see this across every program you look at and use on the internet, have stated that they're putting their artificial intelligence routing of that data and that processing to places that are running on renewable energy. But that is very hard to track, and there's very little transparency on what that actually looks like. And so the other part here is what you're searching on and what you're using AI for is very different in terms of how much energy it uses. Creating imagery from AI takes a lot of energy. It's much more complicated. Doing some text and using text-based is not as complicated and uses less energy intensive processing. So the big picture is there is a lot of work to be done on what is the relative cost benefit of using something like AI for climate tech when it's driving such differences in the energy system. The other part here is there's a scale issue. Electric vehicles and heat pumps and all the other things that are coming on to deal with the energy transition are using far more energy and electricity than data centers. That is true. And that growth is massive. However, there's a public perception here that is different. That is that EVs are clearly moving us away from fossil fuels. Heat pumps are clearly moving us away from using inefficient sources of heat. But AI and data is just being held by a few companies and owned by a few companies and used by not everyone in the world. And that's the second problem. The second problem is who gets to use this climate tech? Now, this is not about climate tech. This is about generative AI, so generative large language models. Basically saying, well, this is the where in the world that people are interested in getting to use this. Classic, obvious example, North America, Australia, Europe are pushing, they're using this the most and really interested in using generative AI, using it the most and owning it the most. Most of the companies, of course, that are producing the large language models are owned in those developed countries. Interestingly, it's the Philippines, which is right behind me, that actually seems to have the most, according to this research, in terms of pushing for and searching for artificial intelligence opportunities and artificial intelligence use on the internet. The long and short of this is that if artificial intelligence for climate tech is going to be used well, who is going to use it and why are they using it? If we are looking at sub-Saharan Africa, there is artificial intelligence being used there, but it's certainly not owned currently by companies in that space. And if that is just becomes a way of extracting wealth out of that population, we start to see again the transfer of wealth to a small amount of people and not ownership broadly across the space. Now, that's not just climate tech, that's any tech associated with AI here. But if we're thinking about the impacts of climate change and the opportunity to change electricity systems and energy systems, there is a disjunct here in who has it and who does not have it. And the last part here is who owns it. So it is currently concentrated ownership in a number of small companies, large companies, but a small number of large companies. And then who gets to decide what the AI will do and who gets to decide how it's developed and who it's developed for and what infrastructure is built to support that. These are all questions that are not necessarily just about climate tech, but are about the way we manage our world going forward in a world that is dealing with climate change. So where to from here? I always I'd love to put up a thing from Craig Walling, and I'm running out of time. So I just want to give us a last snapshot of where we think we could go with this. We have to live within our ecological boundaries. And I love the donut economics from Kate Raworth because it talks about our social foundation, what we need as a society to survive, and our ecological ceiling. Where can we not go? Where do we have to stop so we don't go above and beyond our planetary boundaries? And in that middle, in that green area, that is a safe and just space for humanity to live. AI will play a part in that. Blockchain will play a part in that. Hardware and software and climate tech will all play a part in that. But one of the key things here is that a safe and just space for humanity does not equal vast inequality, and it does not equal just purely technical solutions that are put out into the world. And this has been something that's been close to my heart for over 20 years now, working in this space. And this is climate tech. This is a stove in Honduras where I did my PhD work looking at carbon commodification and carbon finance. And this is a piece of climate tech. The tortilleras in places like Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula would make tortillas all day long to sell, and they would do it on 3 stone fires with tons of smoke and fire and really bad inhalation problems and health problems and really bad emissions. And so climate finance helped to pay for some stoves to go in to make that more efficient and cleaner. Now, there's problems with methodologies and there's problems with carbon offsets and commodities here, absolutely. But the climate tech piece is still there. And that's not a massive piece of technology, but it's a technology that changed people's lives for the better, absolutely, and created some benefits for the environment. And so climate tech doesn't have to be that big, shiny thing, but it also can be something really useful in the emerging economy of things. Now, in Web3, which I work in, I'll come to in a second, we're talking about the economy of things. There's a group called Peak Network. They help build this thing called Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Networks, DePIN. And DePIN is the ability for us to use machines in different places that provide true data on what is happening from the source that enables us to understand how we electrify, how do we change the way the world is working through this interconnectivity of devices. But then how do we layer in transactions that sit on top of that incentivize us to do things differently? And one of those things to do it differently is to broadly own the infrastructure rather than single or large players owning the vast proportion of it. Because if we can start to distribute the ownership of these kinds of technologies, we can start to get incentives that sit there based upon the real data that is being produced. So to bring us back to our friends at this conference, this is ETH Denver, where I was earlier this year, talking about this and working on it and showcasing what we've been doing in the Internet of Energy Network. And that is people on bicycles generating electricity, taking some photos of that and showcasing that that was actually real, placing that into Holochain, which is a fantastic way of distributing data and making sure it's immutable and secure and safe, and then placing that into a token mechanism where people can buy those tokens in a market. What that is doing is saying, this was real data, this was real electricity that was produced, this actually happened at this point in time. The data is there and auditable, you can click through and see it, and now you can buy a piece of that if you want to reduce your emissions by buying a 24/7 carbon or megawatt hour of renewable energy certificates, or you can pre-invest into the infrastructure that's being built to drive this electricity. And it's the same thing that we're doing with clients in Southeast Asia using satellite data, satellite imagery from the ground, and the generation of electricity from solar panels on houses and on factories across this place. And so why I think this is important is that the ability to get great data and provenance from the ground up gives us the ability to use tools like AI in a much better way, and also gives us the ability to distribute the ownership and the equity associated with who gets climate tech and how they can use it going forward into the future. So wave 3 of climate tech, I think we can think about as being pervasive and integrated. So it pervades across the economy and it's integrating the economy. And that's great. That's a great way of thinking about it. I think we can use that to our advantage. It is also a danger, because if we are getting pervasive climate tech, who is going to own it and who's going to control it? And what are the ways in which that is going to influence and stall climate change actions, for example, in the fossil fuel industry, or is it going to accelerate them? I think when we think about the economy of things and this kind of pervasive data, this could mean more participation and more inclusion and more access to solutions. But it also, if we don't get it right, could mean we don't end up going in that direction and end up much more concentrating the wealth into a certain few, which is not where we're going to get to in the future. How might we solve that problem? The final part of this is, if we're to really think about how to make climate tech work, it's not really engineering. Some of it is. It's actually thinking about the critical skills that we need to drive this. I've taken this slogan from actually the Holochain slogan that was put through at East Denver on the back of our t-shirts, was powered by humans. The technological changes that we need to deal with climate change are going to be powered by humans. The large language models we have are trained on the information we already have. They're not really coming up with dramatically new ideas. That might come, but it's not happening right now. The dramatically new ideas, the innovations that are way out there, are coming from humans. And so if we're to understand how we build this and create climate tech for the future, we've got to do it with humans. And so this comes back to what the World Economic Forum talked about, which is the key skills needed: analytical thinking, creative thinking, and self-efficacy skills, resilience, flexibility, and agility. The frontier of climate tech is the skills and abilities of humans to ask themselves the right questions about what they believe is important, the values they hold, and then ask the right questions of the AI models and the blockchain data and the way that hardware is delivered and software used around the world. Because if the humans can ask the right questions and critically think about what is being given back to them, then we can start to see climate tech that can work for everybody. When we get information back from an AI model, it speaks with authority and tells us what it is. But there's hallucinations. Some of the responses are not correct. And it always says in tiny print, check this work. If we don't have humans who can critically analyze that and understand it and get to the bottom of it, we will not get those improvements in efficiencies and the change in emissions and the speed at which we need to deal with climate change. I think this also gives us an amazing ability to think about why and how we train ourselves and upskill and get to this point. So will climate tech save the world? I think it will. Yes, if we consider its human dimensions. And yes, if we focus on transparency, integrity, and equity. And yes, if we equip ourselves and our emerging leaders and decision makers to hold the values which are important around the future of our world and humanity and ecology and the ecosystems that sit on it, and enable us to make the choices around which tools to use when in the very best possible way. So with that, I'm really excited to hear questions. I'm really grateful for being here. Thank you for having me. And it's wonderful to be part of Melbourne Climate Futures, which is an incredible institution doing awesome stuff on this. So thank you, everybody.
That's wonderful, Adam. Thank you very much for that. You covered an enormous amount of ground, and you really added a highly nuanced perspective on the possibilities and pitfalls of climate tech potentially helping us help save us from the climate emergency that we confront. So I do encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A, but we do have some questions that people have already submitted early on with their registrations. But I do want to ask a question, perhaps sort of building somewhat off a question that Guy Abrahams asked that addressed the issue of essentially the issue of techno optimism, and whether the promoting climate tech just creates sort of moral hazard. So, I mean, much of your talk was all about sort of detailing this, Adam, but I'm just sort of wondering, how would you sort of, sort of confront this concern that promoting climate tech is just promoting a techno optimist perspective?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Ben, and a lot of this is driven. So on one side, that the pro market, the pro climate tech is driven by venture capitalists, the markets, the top, look at the top 10 companies in the NASDAQ. They're virtually all tech companies doing AI in some way, shape, or form, and Saudi Aramco. There's the challenge there is that, yes, this whole push that we can solve the problem of climate change with the same things that have created it, basically, that we use markets and that we use technologies to go out there and we just engineer the hell out of it, and that can solve it. And that's from the market. That works because if you own the shares in that company, you're going to push for shareholder returns on this the entire time, and that makes sense because it is a technological solution. And then the kickback against that, as you said, is, well, then we are doing exactly the same thing as the problem that got us into this point, and that technology is not going to be is only going to be owned by a certain few and used by a certain few in a certain way. And if we just rely on technology, we end up in a kind of weird future where everything is commodified and everything is run through a large language model. And where is the reality and the human nature of that? And so, I think this comes back to sort of arguments around neoliberalism and markets, and it's not 1 or 0 on any of this stuff. And the way I see it is, we have to use this technology. We have no way, apart from incredible complete contraction of economies around the world, and move back to just subsistence farming for everybody, yeah, that would definitely get us out of emissions, but it's not going to drive human welfare in any significant way. I think there's a couple of things to think about then. How do we use climate tech in a responsible way that is really based on our values as human beings, as individuals in a society? What do we want to see out of that climate tech, which is going to have a real impact on the environment, versus the stuff which is just competition to make more money? There's a difference there. And competition to make more money is great if it's actually solving the actual problem at the end. But if it's just creating more competition for competition's sake, that's not going to work. And then the final bit is, what is the climate tech that we're not talking about enough? And that is regenerative economics, regenerative farming, which is getting bigger and is getting some traction, but compared to agriculture at scale, it's nowhere near it. But if we can combine things like Internet of Things technologies, economy of things, broad participation in those economies, and regenerative economies, i.e. closed circuit economies, where the money that's created out of generating electricity gets put back into generating more clean electricity and driving other kind of local social environmental benefits, then climate tech becomes this catalyst for really good stuff. But not if we see it as just this engineering solution that we can engineer out, stick mirrors in space and do all that kind of stuff. That will not get us to, well, it could work, it could stop climate change, but it's going to get us to a world that is the same as we have now, highly uneven, probably more so, and a world where risk is very high. Like the risk of those things, you put up geoengineering and the risk, and it goes wrong, the risk is super high, catastrophic. So I think it's really about being nuanced around how we use this stuff, and going back to the core. As I say, it's about humans, is who are we to drive this, and how do we upskill ourselves to make the right decisions about how we drive it?
Yeah, no, that's great. And it really brings to the fore that climate tech needs all these other skills and expertise. It needs business models. It needs regulation and sort of policymakers to understand. And we know that oftentimes our politicians are the last people who are able to really understand this tech. Sometimes it's because of the generations that they're in as well.
Right.
Which sort of gets to one question that Shiv has asked in the Q&A. Is there any possible use cases of influencing consumer habits using AI and climate insights? I thought it was quite interesting the way that you started to sort of intimate even the way that we ask questions through AIs, even the different ways it has different sort of climate and emission impacts.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the answer is yes. There's a number of companies already using AI to help consumers make good decisions around electricity use and which electricity retailer they've got. They're using it to understand climate risk. So how people can put in some terms to understand what the climate risk might be in a certain place. Some of that gets a bit technical, but some of it is being placed for consumers as well. So there's ways that essentially companies are taking large language models and then you make it more accessible to people. That's an important way that everyday consumers can start to engage with it. But yeah, you're right, Ben. The thing that we're spending quite a bit of time on is what are the kind of prompts you need to give to get the right information back, and what are the kinds of structures of artificial intelligence that need to use to enable that data to be better. And that is things like using specific databases of data you want it to talk to, as well as the larger language models. And that's a kind of topic for another day. But what it means is you can get better responses that are more accurate. The challenge is, and well, we're all doing this, right? Everyone's using AI, whether you like it or not. It's happening a lot of the time in the back end of anyway, as you use any kind of technology. But explicitly, when we're using AI to do things, there is a larger call on the energy use. And so what are we asking it, and what's the relative benefit for that? And so I was reading an article and it was saying, well, if me asking the AI makes my work 10 times more efficient and I get to go off and relax or see my kids earlier, then that's going to be useful to that individual for doing it. The challenge is we don't know the outcomes of that yet. And it's not to say it's all bad. In fact, there's loads of good stuff that's going to come from this. Absolutely. It's just a question of how do we understand what's happening on the back end and how do we make good decisions about it?
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll go to a question here from Polly Hughes, who asks an interesting question about could you recommend any favorite initial resources to help understand the basics of AI and blockchain, particularly for uses in supply chain sustainability? Right, and this is particularly relevant for the university at the moment. You'll know that we've committed to being carbon neutral. And we're especially looking at the moment in terms of how we can reduce our scope 3 emissions through our procurement. So our procurement team is looking at doing that and is considering / looking at what sort of resources might be available.
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful question. Thanks, Polly. So there's a lot of different Web2 software providers who are trying to deal with the scope 3 emissions thing, which is basically just the accounting of that. So there's different ways of doing it. You can look at, spend data. I've spent this much money on buying stationery. Stationery has an emissions factor of this, and you plug that into your model, and then you get some kind of understanding for scope 3. It's not very good though. The spend base is kind of like the lowest version of the resolution of data you want. You'd rather have actually how much stuff have we bought? What's the volume of stuff, and what's the carbon associated with the generation of that product? The challenge with that is AI and blockchain systems are emerging on that. So in agriculture, there's a really good company called Giora based out of Sydney that does some great work on agricultural data, places that into the blockchain to show, hey, this is where your supply chain emissions can sit, and other kind of on-farm data. That's a really great example. Some of the stuff we're doing at ION is the Internet of Energy network. So we're looking at the provenance of energy systems. And so what that could be is someone's creating a green hydrogen or green fuel. What does it look like to actually generate that fuel? What is the energy used to do that? How do we take that? So we take that data, place it into Holochain, and then place a token associated with that so you know what it is. And as that goes through a transparency of supply chain, so for your point on the university, Ben, is how far down the line do you want to go on your scope 3? And then what is the data point on each of those points where transactions happen that shows you what you're buying is this much carbon? And so the way we look at it is there's a number of transactions that happen across the supply chain. You might only account for a small part of it, but you might account for a large part of it, depending on which company you are. But whatever part of it you do account for, you need to be able to get down into the data of what that thing was. It could be an invoice that's been a transaction of something that's been bought. For example, you're buying sustainable aviation fuel or some other biodiesel or something like that. Who bought it? Who sold it? Who bought it? What was the volume? And then finally, what was the volume consumed that sits there? And that is a auditable process that using the blockchain as a way, well, blockchain or holochain, there's slightly different ways of doing things, but using that as a way to hold the data really securely. So you can go back and an auditor can come in 3 years' time and go, cool, I'm going to click through and see that data really well. The difference is for a blockchain versus a Web 2 version is on Web 2, that's stored on a web server somewhere on AWS or Google or Microsoft in Azure. And on Web 3, it's stored across a number of different entities, different kind of networks and computers around the world. So my computer is connected to Arthur's computer, to Mary's computer. That gives you more security that data hasn't been tampered with in the meantime, because there will be lawsuits on this. This is director's duties. It's going to be signed. It has to be it's with your financials. There's recourse and there's ways to work through it. It's not like a draconian system, but there will be at some point, and from the public as well, saying you've claimed your scope 3 is this, show me the data. And that we need to be really sure of. And so to answer your question, it's emerging on AI and blockchain for scope 3, but I think the initial part and the way we see it in the energy world is definitely the Web3 blockchain work can really help us understand if the data is true. And that's the starting point.
Yeah, that's great. And as you mentioned, the drivers very much are the sort of the accounting regulations that are emerging in Australia and elsewhere. I've got a question from Elan Fernandez here around AI data sets. And so, you sort of spoke about how we can't necessarily trust what they're coming out with, and sometimes they make up things. So she asks a specific question, though, which I like. How do we ensure that our AI data sets are utilizing the accurate peer-reviewed climate models rather than poorer quality data, given the pitfalls of data accuracy and extrapolation, or poor data versus good data? Is it better to load up our own local data sets or load up a wider range of potentially subpar climate data?
Fantastic question. So, and I'll caveat this, but I'm not an AI expert. I spend my time doing climate change. But what tends to happen when you're using a large language model is you're just using what the model is trained on. They're all trained on different components of what's on the internet. And so you're using a large language model, which by definition is using what's been thrown on the internet in some way, or whatever that model's trained on. If you don't know exactly what it's trained on, you don't know if the accuracy of the answers. Now, what tends to happen is if you ask a generic question to a large language model, it gives you a generic answer. And so it's using all that data. If we're to ask very specific things around climate models, there aren't ways of doing that. And computer scientists will be able to explain this much better than I can. But the general way it works is you can go to a retrieval augmented generation, so RAG database, which is basically saying you're going to put the call in and it's going to pull certain data from that RAG database, which is firstly where it's going to talk to understand what that looks like. So that could be specific data sets that you want to put in there. You drop a whole bunch of PDFs into there or whatever your data model and data sets are, and it uses that to provide you context for the answer. And then the next level of that is our graph databases and different ways that you might have a broader set of data that sits around it that is relevant and true, that when you ask the query to the model, it asks the RAG and it asks the graph network, graph database, and then it asks the large language model. So what it does is using the large language model to generate the kind of language of your answer, but it's using the data sets in those other specific data where you point it to drive an accurate response. And that's what's really important in specific AI mechanisms. So that's the way it is starting to be used in climate modeling. But the key, so you just make sure the models are correct in those things. But the challenge here is we're just making improvements on what we already know. And what if as you quite rightly said, what if the data that's being put in there is incorrect? Or what if someone comes in and tampers with that data and makes it incorrect? It's not unheard of, right? We had ClimateGate right before the Copenhagen conference for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2009, where basically people started saying that where I went to university at UEA for my undergrad, the Climatic Research Unit was like falsifying data on climate change. And it was a massive push from the anti-climate lobby. And it was just completely untrue. But it became the big furor of the whole conference. And so the challenge with this is if those databases are hackable and people can get into them and change them, which is going to change a whole bunch of climate models, then we have a problem. And that's where it starts to get through to this kind of problems around cybersecurity and what does a new internet system look like to make that much better. So that's a kind of pretty short answer on that.
No, but yeah, a fascinating one, and it sort of brings together a couple of questions that I had around how bad actors might be using climate tech to delay the transition, and with an accompanying question around so the problem that we have typically is not that we don't have the tech. The problem has been around political will, right? And the effective functioning of democracy, perhaps. To what extent can you sort of see climate tech sort of assisting the political dimensions of, in terms of our sort of negotiations and conference of the parties and these sorts of things in terms of coming to good decisions?
Oh, that's a good question. So in terms of the bad actors, Ben, one of the things that's interesting that AI has been used and machine learning has been used for a long time to augment the efficiency of fossil fuel extraction. So natural gas, especially, like there's a lot of models that exist already that have been used to, machine learning has been around for quite a long time, and that's been used to make extraction of fossil fuels more efficient. So that is when we have this extra power that comes from these new models can be placed into just increasing our ability to extract fossil fuels from the world. And so that would be just a clear, straight up version of it. In terms of the way we, our democratic institutions is a wider topic than we're talking about today, but the challenge is obviously deep fake and all the problems that come with that, and the ability for this might not actually be Adam talking right now. This could be a version of me that's not me, and that is a worry just in general, especially because that becomes not just for climate change, but it trumps everything else, because no pun intended, but because then people are just concerned about whatever they're getting is incorrect. And so if we get that, and then there's a big push from bad actors who do exist, who still are pushing for climate change not be on the agenda because it's not a big deal. That's not true, obviously, but they're pushing for that. If they can get hold of this, that makes it a lot easier for them to do it. The challenge we've got as organizations like, Melbourne Climate Futures, and we do at ION, we do at Semversa, and just us as people in the world, is just getting as much of the good data as we possibly can, and working together to try and figure out where that data can be sourced and how we can make that as easily accessible for people as possible, and easy for them to see, yes, that's true, and no, that's not true. And that can be done cryptographically. I think there's some really interesting stuff that's happening there, and that can help us continue down a path of broader participation and ownership over, ownership as in like ownership of the problem, but also ownership of the infrastructure that can help us solve it, that can then lead us to be in a much better place in that kind of circle that Kate Raworth talks about in the donut economics, that we are providing social foundation, but we're not exceeding our ecological limits. And the technology sits within that to help us stay there, but we have to make that choice. And so I think the bad actors will essentially be kicked out. And holochain is a very interesting way of doing that technologically speaking, but most people are good. Most people want this to happen in the right way. We have to just have mechanisms that enable us to identify when bad actors are making those or using these systems in a way that is against what generally most people want, which is a safe environment for their children. And I think that's what we can do.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Adam. And I think that takes us to time as well. So it's a very nice way to end up. So, Adam, I really appreciate your presentation here and the experience and wisdom that you actually provided in terms of how we look to climate tech to help us out of this climate emergency and sort of recognizing both the possibilities and pitfalls. So, thank you very much.
And thanks for having me, Ben. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate the questions. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone.